Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about nonsense tactics and strategies in space warfare in fiction, including games. Now, many people these days don't care anymore whether a story is believable. They're more interested in cool. Think all the big tentpole movies. It's a struggle between realism and drama, you might say. And this struggle is rarely won by realism in the movies, and often not in books. It can be won by realism in books. For example, Jack Campbell's Lost Fleet series and its many sequels, but more likely drama wins. Well, in this screencast, I'm on the side of believability, of realism, even though that is the minority. I'd not have done this, I think, but I saw a video on YouTube that offered one take on this, and I saw that mine would be a lot different. So I said, what the heck? It is, of course, an easy target. Many movie makers and novelists know little to nothing about physics and astronomy. They focus on the dramatic, even if it's dumb. I think a lot of them probably learned to write their fiction in television, which is super dumb. Notice, for example, how nuclear weapons, which are anything but personal, tend to be forgotten. They're just too impersonal. People want to make stories personal. Now, here's a list of the problems, and I'll go through each one individually, so I'm not going to leave this up very long. There's no particular order to these, but this one is an egregious one, which is treating space warfare as though it is a World War II aircraft carrier combat. Star Wars does this, many others do as well. But physics in space is far different than physics in a world's atmosphere. There's no air to push against in space. There's usually no gravity. Flying is very different. You can coast forever at the same speed without losing speed in space. Visual range is short on the world, but it's immense in space if you have the right instruments. Speeds are vastly higher in space, too fast for human reaction. Weaponry is immensely different. Really, the whole idea of fighters in space combat is pretty wonky, except in very specific circumstances. The speed of light and relativity come into play. But consider, even in modern world aerial fighting, it's nothing like World War II. Fighters shoot at targets over the horizon, far out of sight. Some interceptors, which are not involved in ground support, may not even carry guns. It's all missiles. So already we've left World War II aircraft carrier combat far behind. Now, another nonsense is having engagement within visual range of the unaided eye. One of the dumber things I saw in a dumb movie, Starship Troopers, which is let's bring a knife to a gunfight, was the invading Earth ships bunching up so that the monstrous aliens could hit them from the planet with farts, very dangerous farts. No, space is enormous. Why would you bunch up? It doesn't make sense. Ships and fleets are most unlikely to be very close together, especially if they're moving at high speed. If they're very close together, they're going to have collisions. Again, even today, air-to-air and sea-to-sea engagements are beyond visual range. The Ukrainians got the Moskva. They couldn't see it, not from where they launched the missile. Another nonsense is boarding actions against defended ships. And this is largely about range of engagement. Space warfare range is inevitably very long, far out of normal sight. Think again of modern combat. How is a ship going to reach an opponent before weaponry decides the issue? Yes, if you can knock out all the defender's weapons on all ships, you can board. Boarding actions were an age of sail thing, or ancient times, when range was short and any long-range weapons were weak. Now, I'll admit, given the right kind of teleporter, maybe you could invade an enemy ship. On the other hand, the enemies would probably invent some kind of defense that would prevent that. So that's a very specialized case. Ramming is another one that makes no sense. Ramming is turning a ship into a big guided missile. Does that make sense? Why not just shoot a big guided missile? It's much safer. This is a matter of range and maneuverability. With the exception of just after the Battle of Lissa in 1866, ramming is from antiquity, where large missile weapons amounted to nothing at sea. The Star Wars 8 hyperspace ramming is nonsense on many levels, since they'd been fighting in space for 40,000 years and nobody devised it, but why not just fire a guided hyperspace missile? Droids are certainly up to piloting such things. It's not necessary to suicide with a ship. Another egregious error really is failure to use rocks, as they're called. Immobile targets, or those with predictable and unchangeable movements, such as planets and moons, can easily be hit by projectiles from very far away. Who needs nukes? You just get a projectile going really fast, and the kinetic energy is worse than a nuke. These can be rocks, they can be asteroids and the like, or they can be manufactured projectiles that get launched from railguns. Give them a strong push, as in a railgun, let gravity speed them up, and kinetic mayhem ensues, though it could be weeks later. Now, if there are enough of these incoming, even a strong defense won't stop them all. It's a cheap way to damage facilities, for example, orbital forts, whether on the ground or on a moon or orbiting somewhere. Another big error is using the environment. For example, hide in the asteroid belt or hide in that nebula. The problem is real space is vast and virtually empty of terrain. When galaxies collide, in fact, stars almost never impact one another. Entire galaxies. Space is really, really, really big. Even if you were in an asteroid belt, there's rarely going to be an asteroid nearby. Unlike the movie and video game depictions of rocks that are close together and somehow they don't crash into each other, they just hold position. When you talk about nebulas, up close instead of light years away, a nebula is extraordinarily insubstantial. It's not going to cause problems. It's not going to block vision. So using the environment, usually a planet or a moon, will work once in a while, but not as a common tactic. And otherwise, space is just empty. Now, I believe this is the last one, which is about ground forces, and just say no. Space warfare is more like naval warfare with islands rather than land warfare. But in space, there are innumerable islands. In other words, if one planet doesn't do for you, another planet or moon or asteroid will serve your purposes. If the enemy fleet is above and able to throw rocks as well as nuclear missiles at the ground, what chance does a ground force have? Yes, they can dig deep, but anything on the ground worth destroying can be destroyed. As long as the fleet doesn't worry about damage done to the planet, as when, say, they're fighting bug-eyed monsters, ground forces are doomed. The only time ground forces make sense is when the enemy has to take the planet. And even then, the defenders are going to suffer vast casualties compared to the attackers. And we might go back to World War II and the Americans taking islands from the Japanese. The Japanese always suffered much worse casualties. It just doesn't make sense. Now, I recall reading two series by the same science fiction author. In one, space war was the exceptionally stupid World War II aircraft carrier. That was the norm. In the other, he used a much more physics-based model, and it made a lot more sense. So he made a decision with the one series, which is a very long series, that he wanted to tell stories about people, not about spaceships, and they didn't have to make sense. They just had to have tension, drama. Authors and movie writers and game designers have to decide what suits their audience. One reason why I prefer grand strategic games is that these kinds of bogus tactics are easily ignored. We don't worry so much about the tactics. We worry about strategies. Thanks for listening.